next presentation is connecting with tribes for land management. While we're getting the presentation set up, I'm really pleased to introduce Don Motanic. Don is part of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. He's a technical specialist with the Intertribal Timber Council and has been since 1995. He had a 42-year career as a forest engineer and forest manager with the Bureau of Indian Affairs that included living and working with the Yakima Nation, Umatilla, and Spokane tribes. He engaged with Native youth through the American Indian Science and Engineering Societies. Don is part of the advisory councils for curriculum and programming and current board president with Wisdom of the Elders Incorporated. He's worked with Washington Agricultural Forestry Leadership Foundation, Washington State University Vancouver Native Advisory Council, the Society of American Foresters, Big Brothers and Big Sisters. He lives at home in Bush Prairie, Washington, has a horse boarding business with his wife, and is currently helping his daughter Jamie move into the breeding and training breeding horses. So please welcome Don.
Which microphone? Remember you're a rock star. Just talk into it.
That's me. Hello, good morning. Imi, Minis, Was, Don Motanic. My name is Don Motanic. Kapsiaga. Thank you. You notice one thing, probably a unique introduction that I did. I was speaking in Mimi Crew when I would walk forward. It was in our tribal, my grandmother's tribal language. When I would speak English, I would walk backwards. And that's just to represent connecting with tribes is also understanding the language, the story. With connecting with tribes, there's nothing else that I say today that normal forestry, most people focus on the bottom line. And with tribes, it's the storyline. You know, and 70% of our language is verb, and 30% is noun. English is 70% noun, 30% verb. Even with our tribal meetings, forestry, 70% of the room is women. And you look at this room, 70% of the room is men. You know, it's almost everything is just about the opposite. In fact, we don't use the word white person, or that word doesn't translate. Suyapi is all the Salish, inner Salish, my mother's Coeur d'Alene, my father's Umatilla, my great grandmother was Climate Modoc. And the Siyapi with Salish language actually means upside down hats. Or they wear, things are upside down, they come from the upside down world. So that's the other thing, I'll have a slide here that kind of illustrates kind of more a modern depiction of even in our artwork, how things are different, or almost, we have to think backwards. My father spoke the language from birth till 10, you know, he could speak several languages, but he didn't learn English until he went to boarding school. My parents had a Chemawa Indian boarding school. You see my finger? Okay. Anyway, I'll go ahead and start my presentation. A lot of debate something, well, I'll do one more description for some people who are virtually watching this, and think about a timeline or the history of forests here in this is Nisqually country. And Billy Frank was a good friend of mine, so it's always great to be here. We're in the David Scott room or hall. David Scott was one of my professors. I graduated from the University of Washington back in 1978, silviculturist and ecologist. But one of the things that David Scott always was in when he taught class, he always made sure he knew everybody's story. He would actually host a dinner for the whole class. So that way, he was pretty well connected with tribal people because he knew the important part was the forest storyline and not just the bottom line. But,
Sharing.
But she said she didn't.
but, what, but what, I'm starting out with, or I'm having some of the history of tribal forestry is understanding that story when you work with individual tribes who may not be from this area, but other parts of the area. There's 29 tribes in state of Washington versus 9 tribes in the state of Oregon. People will always ask, why is that? Why are there only 9 tribes in Oregon, and 29 tribes in Washington? I do have a handout in the back of the room that has a map of the 29 tribes, and it has a website. It's washingtontribes.org. So it's really fine print, but if you want to get into contact with the tribes, it has their website. So that's one of the handouts that I have. Another handout that I have is from goodgrub.org, Ken Gather and Grow. It has a list of, I think, about 19 different trees and uses, medicinal, and a little bit about the tribal language, even the word for Douglas fir. In this curse, it's Pats, P-A-A-P-S is the word for Douglas fir. It's not about a person. You know, Douglas is the name of a person, but it actually describes the wood itself, that it's easy splitting. And then that's what the tribal word, like a verb, will actually describe what it's used for. If it's used for what type of medicinal purpose, a lot of our medicine people are females because they understand the food and the teas and those type of things, and even the negative aspects of using some of those. That's one of the things in this handout. It says, please refer to your doctor, because I've been in the sweat lodge when a group of us, we had the medicine person asked us, what are we aiming from? What do we need? And it just happened to be pulled muscles. We were all playing basketball. We had pulled muscles. So he ground up the right types of roots and needles. And then it was like super duper Bengay. I think Johnson and Johnson would love to know that prescription or how I did it, but I could walk. I was really limping in there, but once I got out of the sweat lodge, I felt like I had brand new legs. It was just unbelievable. But then the other side of it, the other time I went to a sweat lodge, people had like hay fever. It was like during the springtime. So again, I didn't have that problem, but when he was grinding up again, but this is a different medicine person. But what it did to me, like I had one bad knee, like my knee blew up. You know, I had a hard time walking just because my one knee just got swollen. So that's one of the reasons why when you look at the sweat handout, it says refer to your doctor. So is this working? Okay, anyway, one of the things, I'm retired from the Intertribal Timber Council, and you heard the introduction that I grew up in Seattle, got my degree, and then went to work back on the reservations. Oh, there you go. Is it the right one? Yeah. Okay, that's, okay. 9 minutes, and I want to make sure we got time for questions, but this is something I'm, an outline, I'll probably go through some of the things pretty quick on some of the things, but background, doctrine of discovery, 10 elements. Lewis and Clark, Oregon Trail, Indian Wars, Land Donation Act 1850, treaties, reservations, Oregon and Washington Constitution, made big wide, there's 29 in Washington versus 9 in Oregon, termination, restoration, timeline, and tribal laws, and sharing new memories and image. One of the things, like if you stretch your hand out like this, roughly 6 feet, 32 inches. This would represent 10,000 years where tribal language was in existence. 200 years of European management, English, that's like your fingernail. So just think of the stories and connecting with tribes. The tribes have this wingspan of history and language, and new forestry or the modern forestry is only a fingernail of 200 years. This is one of my favorite sayings: where common memory is lacking, where people do not share the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, a common memory must be created. Litigation is no way to build a community. And George Erasmus is a leader from Canada. Again, it's the storyline versus the bottom. Litigation is always tied in the bottom line. Oh, this is just a little bit of family of my father. This is 1915, baby. My aunt Esther's, there's a statue in Pelton, Oregon. Learned tribal and European languages. He actually was a interpreter in World War II because he could understand. That's the picture of my father back in World War II with his little radio. They all had to know how to do that and listen as interpreters, but they recruited tribal members along the Oregon Trail because they could speak all the different languages. And with my mother, Coeur d'Alene means heart, like an awl. One of the reasons why is because they played a lot of stick game. My Pendleton, Umatilla is a rodeo fan with lots of horses. My mother's family, they all played stick games, even kind of modern. It wasn't just for money, but this shows the women, they had material games is what they called it, or still call it anyway. That's a picture of me back 50 years ago working in the Seattle watershed. Protect, adapt, and coexist instead of controlling. It's adapting to the forest. There's 200 tribal languages in the US, and I mentioned the 70% versus 30%. Now, Grading Sweetgrass is the name of the book. Robin Kimmer, Dr. Robin Kimmer wrote about that. One interesting thing, over 5,000 of the 30,000 firefighters are tribal. This is back in 2018. 2% of the population, but 18% of the firefighters. A lot of them in Montana. I was regional forester in Billings, and we had 2,000 firefighters, tribal firefighters in Montana. I'm using this ice age, kind of showing you, or some of you may be aware of the Great Lake that was in the Palouse area, Moses Lake, that really kind of divided my mother's tribe, Coeur d'Alene, versus where Yakima, Umatilla. But when you look at this ice sheet from 10,000 years ago, look at the languages, 24 different languages in the state of Washington, the Columbian, the Shopton, or the Columbian Inner Salish. And that language, you can just overlay that language with that 10,000-year-old ice age. And I mentioned before, Suyapi is upside down. Calling somebody white actually objectifies a person instead of being subjective. Rosie Caillou was a friend of mine that I met. We started talking about this. There's a movie called Smoke Signals where there's a backwards car, this was on the photo, actually, that's my cousin, Elaine Miles, is a cousin, she used to be in that TV show, Northern Exposure. Off, Dr. Fleshman, the doctor's, receptionist, that's my cousin that we grew up next to, but in the movie itself, they use that backwards car to represent what I was doing here this morning. Europeans live in a noun world with objective science, without traditional knowledge. Tribal world is with birds, describe a dynamic force. If you're looking at a working force, you would want a working word language. So that's one of the things that the tribes are trying to tell their stories. One of the biggest impacts that had on, that this really isn't talked about, even with the, since time immemorial curriculum that they use in the state of Washington now, is the 10 elements of the doctrine of discovery, papal back in 1493 for European countries laying claim to the US. On the right side there, what popped up was actually a brand. Lewis and Clark actually went through on their trail and actually branded logs as US, just like when I was up at working in the forest, we had firewood, we could brand the firewood and say that that had been purchased. But its first discovery, contiguity, you've probably heard of, that's when Europeans, if they built a building or a fort at the mouth of the river, they could claim the whole watershed. Like the French Quarter in New Orleans, the French claimed the whole Mississippi watershed. When you think about the Louisiana Purchase, that's why the French Quarter is where it is. That's why they built at the mouth of the Clinton River. The US built a fort so they could claim the whole Northwest. And the British and the British had Fort Vancouver. But that's what's called contiguity with the watershed, terra nullius, unused land. If the Europeans thought the land was being unused, they could claim it. That's actually, in a sense, putting a title in a name. That's usually by a person. Again, just the opposite way. Tribal people receive their name from the land. They don't put the land in their name. Because you think of Bifford Pinchot National Forest, does that really tell you what the forest is about? Or Mount St. Helens was named after the Baron of St. Helens, an island off the coast of England. That doesn't tell you the story versus it smokes, is what the tribal people say about the name about St. Helens is it smokes. But that's the first part of the first 3 parts of the 10-part doctrine of discovery. The third part, or the second part of 3 parts, is actually occupancy, or actually putting title of the land. Actual occupancy and current possession, preemption, and European title. In a sense, you have, there's Indian title, which is more occupied, whether you really own it or occupy it. Where tribal people think their ancestors have been buried there for 10,000 years, so in a sense, they always occupy it, but they may not have, you only have title in a sense when you're living, the 70 to 90 years that you're living. And there's limited sovereign rights with tribes. That's something that's in Section 8 of the Constitution. It's the only modern colonial country that has something noted in their constitution about tribes. Places like Canada, other colonial countries never have that in their constitution, but the US Constitution has. And also civilization that starts getting into, I call it the control part of the doctrine of discovery. The first of the 3 parts is actually labeling it in your name. The second part is actually claiming the right or title. That's the second part. And the third part of the 10 parts of the doctrine of discovery is the control part. And back in between 1823 and 1832, or Justin John Marshall, trilogy, federal versus state rights of tribes, that's actually quoted in all the tribal laws now. It's going back that far. And then the last two parts is conquest, just wars. This is something on Wallowa Lake, the 14th Cavalry patrolling. They were based in Fort Walla Walla to ensure this first did not return back to their land. It's interesting, between the Washington territory and the Oregon territory, if you draw a line straight across where like Milton Freewater Wall, if you draw that line straight east, it goes right underneath the current Nez Perce reservation, that they didn't want any tribal people blacklisted in the Oregon Constitution. Interracial marriage was outlawed in Oregon. Interracial marriage was allowed in the state of Washington. And I get into a little bit more some of the differences. One of the things with the Northwest Oregons, with how states are actually developed, you needed 50,000 people to establish a state. That's one reason why Oregon was established in 1859, and the state of Washington was established in 1889. Because Oregon was able to have 50,000 people before the state of Washington. Actually, Walla Walla was bigger than Seattle before 1880. But they, this was a list of the wagon trails coming out. There wasn't many coming out until 1843 with the first territorial land donation of granting a married couple 643 acres. That was to encourage people to move out. They really didn't talk about that much. But you start seeing through the years, the Euro-American population going from 700 coming out in 1841 up to 52,000 in 1860. And I put there, of course, the deaths, the Indian wars that were going on. The U.S. was at war with tribes from 1776 to 1924. It was up to 1924. There was an Apache allotment outside the city of Payson where the family was still fighting for their allotments outside Payson instead of being pushed back to San Carlos Apache that I talked to the forest manager down there. And here's something with, because it was papal, there's 10 commandments. But there's 10 elements of the doctrine of discovery, and the last one was Christianity, creation story about control. Genesis 1:28, fill the earth and rule over the sea and birds. And Yale Forestry School has a forestry school in divinity. That's one thing Gifford Pinchot was part of. And he had the first duty of the human race is to control the earth it lives upon. That's a quote from Gifford Pinchot. And silviculture, the definition Society of American Foresters, silviculture, the art and science of controlling the forest. That's still in existence today, is how it's defined. Versus tribal creation stories are about water and coexistence with birds that describe a symbiotic relationship with the forest, like a healing medicine tree you read in that handout, of which trees are referenced with that as the literal translation. And I mentioned the Land Donation Act. A lot of the neighborhoods in the city of Portland have the names of, there's a Ross Island, there's a Cullen neighborhood named after the first person who received 640 acres. Over 7,000 claims for 2.5 million acres of free land. And the tribes have never compensated, especially the tribes of Southwest Washington or Southwest Washington and Northwest Oregon. And also the California railroads, 1960, Congress claimed 2.4 million acres of old sea land. And the 70,000 acres today with BLM. This is more in southwest, but it's kind of unique where, there seems to be more corporate. You see the warehouse, where the warehousing land would be located in this, northern Pacific 100-mile wide band running from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound. And public land was sold to the private, timber companies. When I worked in Spokane, I noticed there was a lot more smaller family mills, like 13 different mills in Northeast Oregon. It wasn't as corporate, even though there wasn't always a cascade mill up that to that kettle falls. And again, this kind of shows the, just the, Oregon and Washington territory. This is a picture of the Northwest region of, I mentioned there's 33 tribes, 29 tribes in the current state of Washington and 33 in the, old Washington territory, 9 in Oregon, and 10 in the, old Oregon territory. A lot of this was due to the manifest destiny of special virtues and institution America's mission to redeem and make the world our image. And this was just, then it was the termination era, but it really was going for, well, one of the other important thing that happened in 1877, there was treaties. There were a lot more treaties in the state of Washington around the Puget Sound area, 1855 treaties that around the Puget Sound, 1855 treaties for Yakima, Nez Perce, and Umatilla, Spokane, and Colville are executive order back in 1881. After 1887, there was the Dawes Act where we started to buy. There was like 64, well, roughly about 100, about 120, 130 million acres of tribal land. And that was cut in half when they did the Dawes Act, when they allotted individual Indian allotments, like a place like Quinault has a lot of individual Indian allotments. So my brother and I have shares in Indian allotments at Umatilla, Nez Perce, and Coeur d'Alene, but they were trying to convert tribal members into farmers. And what other surplus land was left over, it was sold off. Again, no compensation for the tribe. In the 50s, they started terminating tribes in this, mainly in the state of Oregon and Northern California. Douglas McKay, a cardinal in Portland, was the Interior Secretary for the Oregon governor. This is kind of going towards the modern 750 million acres of forest, 408 private, 248 federal, 75 million is state, 19 million is tribal. This kind of just goes more into Oregon tribes that were actually reestablished more forest land back in 2018. This kind of shows the percentage of tribal land, just 15% or 1.5% is tribal land in Oregon, but there's 7% in the state of Washington. Again, more tribes, more forest land, so more opportunity to work with tribes, but I'm trying to make sure that you have a little background on how to approach tribes or work with tribes. Like if you go to a meeting, you might see more women in the meeting or the leadership in a lot of our tribes. It's more maternal than maternal, actually. And the aunties, they call it. The aunties are very important in our tribal culture that includes forestry. But 7%, again, not too much, only 0.3% in Oregon. And then, I believe it was like 3% in Montana. So each state has a little bit difference of why there's more or less tribal land, tribal forest land in these states. And a lot of it has to do with the constitutions. But starting in tribal forestry laws, and There really wasn't any, there was a Snyder Act, which I believe was passed about 1910, but it wasn't until 1990 there was a National Indian Forest Resource Management Act. There's an Evergreen magazine back there that really describes the impact of this National Indian Forest Resource Management Act. There's, part of that act is there's an assessment of Indian forest lands every 10 years. There's a report by a third party, not by the federal government, not by the tribes, but an actual independent study. One of the recommendations back in 1990 is, and part of what was going on through the years is develop policy to help the tribes. National, or the 2004 Tribal Forest Protection Act. This is back when there was fires in 2003. In San Diego, it started on Forest Service land and started to go through tribal land in Southern California. The tribes felt that the Forest Service wasn't managing enough, not cutting enough and burning enough, and that's why they wanted to develop stewardship contracts between tribes and other landowners. So that's when this law was passed. 2014, there was an Indian Trust Asset Reform Act, like the Secretary of Interior no longer signs timber sales. There's a few tribes that have this. 2018 Farm Bill, the Good Neighbor Authority is to the tribes, and 638 with the Forest Service, where with the Forest Service, when I was forest manager, the tribe was treated as an outside contractor, not as a government contractor. They did have government contractor with the Department of Interior, but not the Department of Agriculture, and that's where the Forest Service is. So they, with this one particular law with the Farm Bill, which is still existing today, in fact, they're doing it up in Alaska. Alaska is a different act, the Alaska Native Claim Act. Senator McCoskey has proposed to have the native corporations and the villages treated the same as the tribes in the lower 48, so that's going on. We just have some biochar, there's a tribal energy bill, biomass pilot projects. And one thing that caught, when they did this assessment, one thing that caught Congress's eye was how efficient the tribes were at managing their land. You know, that is basically $3 an acre versus $9 an acre. Why were the tribes able to manage their land at about 30 cents on the dollar as compared to the Forest Service? There was a high NEPA cost, and it was just science. With the tribes, there's lower NEPA costs and science and traditional knowledge. So it's active, like my mother's tribe, where she grew up on Spokane. Now they've been harvesting the timber since 1910 sustainably. And Caldwell's the same way. Menominee is another tribe where they've been harvesting timber since the 1880s. So they're seeing the sustainability. When I was at, that's like roughly $3 an acre nationally, but at Spokane, it was $5 an acre. That's 100,000 acres, and that budget was $500,000. So that was $5 an acre at Spokane. And working, this is kind of a neat story. I went back in 40 years ago when I was forest manager. I had an older, really Dick. He worked with the Forest Service. He was a non-vet, but he worked as a dispatcher with the Forest Service, state and the tribes. So he was there working with the, like in '82, he had a dream. I wish I could get the Forest Service working with the tribe and actually move their office on the Umatilla Reservation. And that was back in 1982, 40 years ago. Marie Dick and Louis Ackley, he said he passed away. He always had safety meetings. That's what he would call safety meetings. All of us would always get together and have dairy pizza down at the pizza place. There were people from state, federal, private owners. We would all get together and have dairy pizza. That's what we call safety meetings. And lo and behold, back in 2012, the Forest Service moved, or the tribe built the building, and the tribe that's right across the street from the Horse Casino. So it's the only Forest Service office on tribal land based on this, all the safety rules. So that's in our Indian country, I call it feed us and lead us. You know, if you have good food, you always find out who the best banquet cooks, and if they found out in our tribal community who was baking the fried bread or cooking the food, everybody would show up at the meeting at 6 o'clock in the evening, just because it was great food, but a good conversation. So, yeah, anyway, I saw some smiles today, so that's good. And kind of the end where common memory is lacking, where people who not share the same past and can be real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. It's kind of the end. And this was the photograph I showed, what you probably see in Colombia. That controlling nature with science. And today, in the future, indigenized, coexisting with nature, with science and traditional knowledge. Hopefully you can support anything the tribe when they do this land acknowledgement. It's just not acknowledging the land, but supporting the tribal members, especially their youth with their language, because the literal translation is active. We want active management. So if that verb is active, that supports the tribe and your knowledge about how important those medicines are. And a student actually drew this, is actually just again the opposite. When I went did forward with my tribal language, I went backwards with my English language. So Cassiopeia, when this person needed to questions or dialogue.
So what did the Indians do for, I guess, forest people, and what did the forest people do for the Indians? I mean, it's related, so.
Right, I'll give you an example with the freedom of the new laws. One of the things that happened recently, I'll give the first one. There used to be a Jobs in the Woods, remember the spotted owl and Jobs in the Woods. One of the examples down by Chehalis, there's a Lincoln Creek landowners down by Chehalis, and there was this Jobs in the Woods money, and they wanted to get that private owners, the NRCS and Wildlife Service could get access to this, so this landowner wanted to build a fence around his pasture and his trees, but also have access for his horses and cattle to the creek. And he was able to do a cost share, but the landowner was really frustrated with the government, the federal government, because of just all the barriers. But the Chehalis tribe was actually able to say, well, we'll take the contract and you work directly with us. So they were actually able to, they had this little nose, it was, I think it was a German, pump thing. The horses would actually put their nose on this pump and the water, they were able to use that, put the water in this little basket. It was really unique. But the Lincoln Creek Landowners Association had an agreement with the Chehalis tribe on developing several of these jobs. But they had the fence built, dogwood trees. They wanted to find trees that were resistant to beaver. You know, we have a beaver farm on our property, and the beavers, and then we needed to find, well, what trees can we plant? And so all this money, there was actually a cost share, and the tribe took the contract instead of the other federal agencies, because they could go directly to the tribe there at Rochester instead of going to Olympia. There's another tribe, the Mason County, I can't remember the name of the tribe, but at Mason County, when they were landowners within the reservation, had to do building and development, they have to go to several county offices to get different permits. But when they went to the tribe, they just needed one permit in one office. That's what they're at Mason County. Up there in Tulalip, the first 638 contract with the Forest Service is actually beaver removal. Back then, a couple of years ago, the state of Washington actually outlawed contractors of relocating beaver. But the tribe, because its sovereignty and its landowner was within the reservation, they were able to use the tribe's sovereignty to actually get funding to move the beavers, because the tribes want to do, there's lots of things that the tribes want to do that landowners are also doing, or even if you're, depending where you live at, if you're adjacent to a tribe, if you have land, say if you want to burn, or if you want to harvest timber, you know, the more volume that you have, you know, higher your price will be, or the logging costs will be lower, you know, so if you're doing projects adjacent to a reservation, it's finding out what their plans are, you know, over time, as to coordinate your plans with the tribes. So the tribes have some in these laws. Excuse me, it's kind of interesting. Each farm bill that comes up, the tribes are getting better access to that, even with, agroforestry. I'm involved with an agroforestry project now, getting more funding to support, agroforestry projects now too. So hopefully this is just, the door is just opening for adjacent landowners to work.
I was gonna say agroforestry, what do you mean?
Well, with, again, you know, the western agroforestry, your silval pasture, wind breaks, those type of things, that's what, the Department of Agriculture has its, definition of agroforestry, but what they're finding, a lot of it, there's a cross, again, the storyline, it's not linear, but the non-timber forest products. You know, tribal people almost look as agriculture, the foods, that's almost, the foods and medicines are really number one, or have the most stories with our forests, so it'll be interesting as we go through this project. It's a pilot project in the Northwest, working with tribes like our basket weavers. You know, what type of birds do we need for the materials for basket weaving? You know, maybe not as hot as maybe, the birds might be hotter for, you know, silvicultural type of things, but maybe a different prescription for, even safety. When I think about what you needed to do as a burn loss qualification, do you need to be a burn loss for some of these, working with elders out there with prescribed burns? So it'll be interesting, but the definition for agriculture, hopefully it's going to change, where it's not backwards as the tribal people, forward with multiple uses with agroforestry.
Yeah, I was thinking of this profit, fiber profits, you know, that didn't work.
It's just not trees, that's the one thing that maybe the important difference is just not trees, like I was mentioning, the silver pasture or windbreaks, it's always focused on the trees, but not on other parts of the forest.
With respect to, difference between forestry and agriculture, it's, like Christmas trees, if you harvest them, you harvest them up to age 12. And that's considered agriculture. Anything over age 12 is here considered, forestry. But I've got a place down the road here, and, I'm going to be replanting a bunch of Doug fir. And, once they're in, then I'll be putting some cows back in to eat the grass. Because I found out years ago that unless you starve the cows down, they're eating nothing else. They don't like Douglas fir, the hemlocks or anything else. And I attended the World Agroforestry Conference sometime in 91 or 92 at WSU, and it was interesting that a lot of it in Australia, they'll plant trees in which some of the ponds and everything that come down are very high in nutrients and so forth, and the cattle graze into that, they still get the wood along with that. So agroforestry has quite a range of things. The other thing I was kind of curious about, the tribes in this state now, I think the casinos are taking in over $5 billion. And I was wondering how much money of that goes to, being utilized in areas like natural resources or anything, if you have any input on that.
I guess I'll start with the first question, then get to see. The first thing, it's kind of interesting, there's a BIA fire map where we live on the reservation, at Spokane anyway, there was a little, on the Spokane River, there's little falls. It's like the last dam on the Spokane River, but we live up above that. And you mentioned like cattle or whatever. But we had an animal that actually thinned around, it was like 20 acres where we lived at. And the forest around, all around this house burned, except this 20 acres. Because of the thinning of the use of this animal. That saved the house, or saved the property, because there was an animal that did the thinning. It wasn't cattle, it was porcupines. The porcupines were actually in. I had to pull porcupine quills from our dog and our horse. That was quite the job, but I didn't, well, I'll set, that's another story. But it's, you know, again, a tribal version of how the porcupines save this land by the thinning that they do, you know, chew on the seedlings. The second part, if you go to, the new Portland airport, they have this mass timber project there that came from, the Coquille tribe in Yakima. Yakima had a 2015 fire, and that's where those timbers, some of the mass timbers came from the Portland airport. Yeah, but, I knew the man, Steve Rickon, UW graduate, I knew the family. That sawmill, almost shut down. You know, it's the only sawmill in south central Oregon now. They're at Lake Swan. And the only way that one saw, the Boise Cascade had a fight with the Yakima. But the only reason that sawmill survived, even end up 10 years later to do the mass timber project, was a casino. That forestry was important enough to the Yakima tribe that funded from the legends. Usually it's land and language. With our Umatilla tribe, I sat with the elders back in 1998, and the elders said, well, we want, the most important thing to us, the elders, is the language and the land. So in a way, Yakima did the land was the sawmill, the support of the forest management there. So that's how that will survive. If it wasn't for the casino money, that mass timber project from milled by the tribe itself, it wouldn't be around. Yes. Good questions.
So, you mentioned Robin Walkhammer and, this curriculum is wonderful. I've used it before. It seems like there's trajectory and really, starting to see more traditional knowledge being integrated into natural resource management. At least around, you know, the county that I'm working in. And I'm curious if that's translated to the training programs within, like, for example, University of Washington. Are you aware of any traditional knowledge being incorporated into like forestry training?
So what was, before you said that, before I couldn't catch?
I feel like there's trajectory around utilizing traditional knowledge and working with tribes in natural resource management. And I'm just wondering if that's also filtering to the training programs,
Yeah.
like college training.
I showed the tribes, there's 3 states that have tribal history as part of their curriculum for K through 12. And that's the state of Montana. That's actually in their constitution. That was the first state to acknowledge the tribe's history, values, in 1999. And then the second state was the state of Washington, since time immemorial curriculum. That was the second state, and then the third state was the state of Oregon shared history. And in their shared history, they do acknowledge and track what's going, that I track it just because of helping younger students. Probably most of our, it's interesting that the Intertribal Timber Council has research grants for students to study. It's like 70% of the grants and the research is about water. You know, when for our tribe anyway, when we have our meals, again, like the Christianity, instead of saying amen for the blessing, we actually say choosh, and that's the word for water. You know, that's how we say, again, connected with the land, amen. You kind of have to think about, well, what does that mean to me? Because amen could mean a lot of things to different people. But water, 70% of our body is water, 70% of the leaves and the trees is water, so the tribes say. Water is what, water and fire. And then, my father was trying to do the yin and yang of our tribe, black and white is, it's like the word for pepper is, tanam, stun. Stun, stunning, again, a word, and then the word for, salt is katnwakush, which means mixer. And it even ties into our creation story of water being a mixer and, that was part of the story, the different animals, stunner being the sun, and, the fire part, and fire and water is kind of the yin and yang of even when we were showing. Somebody, or the previous presenter was showing kind of the four quadrants or the four directions or, the medicine wheel. There's day and night, and in between dusk and dawn is part of, the whole thing with our different medicine wheels. But it's, there's more, one of the most popular, webinars or YouTube is about tribal fire. That right after the Paradise Fire in California with Yurok tribe and doing a YouTube in like November of 2022, but whenever that Paradise Fire was in California, there was like 3,000 people that viewed that YouTube. It was about industrial use of force with tribes, but everybody on the questions that were asked, it was all about fire. How do the tribes do fire? What's the benefits of fire and the management? And that's something that's coming up. Well, that's part of this agroforestry project is the use of fire. How to use it, where to use it, how much to use it. And my part anyway, when I go there, I said, well, don't forget about water. It's all like forestry seems to be biochar and that thing, but again, at the end of our meals, we say choosh. Because that's what processes are, as we pass away. We lose our water, we lose our water as we go.
I may actually have a good related sort of follow-up to the previous question. So I'm a forestry instructor at the UW, and we do have certain professors who work in a lot of tribal knowledge. In particular is Professor Ernesto Alvarado, who works on fire. I particularly focus more on silviculture, and I really try to bring in as much as I can as far as indigenous knowledge. But something to ask you about, Don, is I've actually encountered, not with all tribes members, but some in particular, for instance, I've interacted with the Yakima tribe fairly frequently. I've sometimes encountered tribe members who meet me with a little bit of distrust, and they sort of decline to share knowledge. I've actually had encounters where people have, for instance, said things as extreme as saying, I'm raising my young child not to trust a white person. So I think there's a huge amount of potential for collaboration, for us incorporating indigenous knowledge into what we already know and advancing what we know. But how would you recommend dealing with the historic issues that cause sort of those hard feelings a lot of the time and moving forward and trying to come to some productive conversation and a willingness to collaborate and work with each other despite those differences?
Great question. There's been a big wall between tribal people, the people who are not tribal, getting that knowledge, well, especially from men. It's interesting to watch that. I watch women, and I'm actually part of that class, Ernesto and Tom Hinckley, Holly Olson, that I speak with about the size of class. They actually go to after they go through the class, they actually travel to the Yakima Nation and go to their Camp Chaparral. Camp Chaparral is actually Dick Tracy comic. Google is really kind of cool when I saw that, but historical trauma really hasn't been studied in our tribal community until 1995. That's when the, epigenetics, it's something of how genetically trauma is intergenerational handed down. And even one of the toughest speeches or doing for me was actually back at my parents' eulogy. I think about when your father was buried, and you need to tell the story or that type of thing. Like I mentioned, it wasn't until 1995 that they actually discovered this going on and why people are having a hard time getting up, in a sense, telling their story. And I would, like I said, I always try to think about how can I tell the story to this group differently or more uniquely while I went forward and backward. But one of the things that I tell, well, in fact, even when I talk with classes, almost that I reference 988, the number for mental health, but I notice it more in younger people when I talk with older people. But one of the things that an elder storyteller told me is as you're speaking, well, the best compliment is if a woman comes up to me and says, I cried when I heard your story, you know, from tragic to magic, or doom to gloom, or doom to gloom is what I say, you know, with some of my stories. But what this elder told me, I said, well, I had a hard time standing up and doing my father's eulogy at the Longhouse. And what he told me was that as men, especially linear thinking, you know, not the story arc of an action, barrier, and emotional beat. Those are the three parts of the story arc. As getting to this emotional beat is where scientists have had a hard time going over. But what he told me, I thought about it when I wanted to offset my emotions. So I walked around and our daughter said, Dad, you almost knocked over the flower that I used to still think I go. And I told that to the elder, but the elder told me, even when you're sitting down, you can kind of hear this heartfelt story, is to take a deep breath and change your story pattern. If you listen to former President Obama speak, that's what I tell kids now, you know, when I'm mentoring kids. I said, women, I'm always jealous of women because they have this great control of their emotions. Women do, but men don't. You know, that's when I sit out in the audience and watch somebody explain or tell their story. Do they have a part in the story? You know, if I have one of my daughters, it's hard for me to talk about one daughter in particular sometimes, just because she's the one who holds my hand all the time. Versus the other daughter, which is great, but it's finding that time when you stop and think about what you're saying, or actually use the pause to emphasize what you say. And in forestry, you know, when I was at University of Washington, of course, that was always the bottom line. As a forest engineer, it was always the bottom line. You know, how can you get the payload out at the least amount of cost per volume, through roads and all that part, even as a forest manager. But that's what a superintendent told me. He said, like, people and money, if you can control or work with those two things as a manager, you know, the rest of them be easy, but it's actually working with and understanding that each tribal member, each family, each tribe has a different historical trauma. Like there's 29 tribes it's listed with this tribal, each one of those tribes, like the Spokane, they still have the Wilpinit Redskins. The tribe wanted, you know, that you think about the urban Indians would never have a mascot as a redskin, but the Spokane tribe wants to continue to have the Wilpinit High School known as the Redskins, which is just the opposite of what urban Indians would think about. So those type of things are, when I went to Umatilla to pass resolutions or management plans, I had to go to seven different committees. An economic committee, a cultural committee, a forestry committee, a wildlife, you know, there were 7 different, it was like going through Congress, working with my own tribe. But when I went to my mother's tribe at Spokane, we would pass resolutions and plan, we would do it in the coffee shop. We would do it in, I would talked with, my neighbor was a tribal chairperson. Two of the tribal chairpersons were my neighbor. So I just go into the tribal office and let's go have a cup of coffee, and we sit down, and the chairperson would say, why, there was 5 tribal council people of the Spokane, so we just needed 3 council people to pass a resolution. So we would pass resolutions in the coffee shop or the cafeteria. That's the way the Spokane, it might be a little bit, I asked folks back there how it's still going. But again, and then I asked even with, my own tribe, even tell them I do comment on the comprehensive plan for the tribe. I know there's layers of 7 different commissions and committees, so each tribe's a little, sometimes you can do it in the coffee shop. Sometimes you have to go through like an act of Congress with a tribe, and you have to know what. I usually go to, when I visit different tribes and reservations, I usually talk to the cultural center person. Usually it's a woman, and she knows the ins and outs of the tribe, but even when you talk to people outside the building, local tribal members, you get more of the story than the political thing of which people are easiest to get along with, but go to the tribal cultural center and get to know whoever that director is, and you'll probably learn a lot more about the tribe or how to work with them, if it's fast. Is it the coffee shop version? Or the act of Congress with 7 different committees, like I mentioned, even that Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, those 2 separate tribes. There was the Eastern Shoshone tribe, which was the home tribe. The Arapaho tribe was from the Denver area. They brought it up to Wyoming to get them off the transcontinental railroads. They only get 10% of the funding because they are in a sense a visiting tribe, but they're within the Wind River Reservation. So each reservation is a little bit different with each country. And again, I mentioned how the state constitutions are set up, and you look at why are there 9 tribes in one state and 29 in another. It's kind of knowing the history or common memory. But getting that meant, like I mentioned, both my parents went in boarding school. I've done testimony for the boarding school commission, and I've done for missing indigenous women and people, because our sister's body was recovered in Mexico. So we have that, each of our families have those tragedies, and they're hard to talk about, like I said before, with elder storytellers, like I have the Roger Fernandez story. You listen to, when you look at the YouTube video, he can explain what was humor, because I mentioned breathing. He starts off a lot of his stories with humor, because when you laugh, it's like an endorphin type of thing. Well, that's what I thought I saw some people. So I guess the question is getting closing time.
Yeah, we've got about a minute.
Okay. I've heard a lot of politics today, but I've told you there more, Motanic, technology. There's a woman named Turning Guns to the World War in 1985. He talked about how all of the forest species and the how that and I know that Congress and started today talk about actually starting to remember that 87 maybe not really bad. Talk about the various shelters around the that they have in the use of slavery. Just curious about how much is transpiring.
That's what this one sheet is, with good grub, can gather and grow. In fact, their website is down. They're redoing the curriculum, curriculum, hopefully to add more of the tribal language in it. The actual literal translation, and maybe the last little chuckle for today, my mother's tribal lead. What would the word for car or automobile would be? You would never think of, when you think about water and relationship, but it's wrinkling feet is the word for automobile, because you think of tires on the ground, it's not, but what's left with the literal translation of automobile.
Really, I was thinking of one of the things that mentioned that you can unlock media, especially not to make the And that's what that's a lot, that's a lot of that, it takes time and invest in. No time, about it. So, it's,
That's what's in this handout. The website, I mentioned 19 different trees and the trees and that, but you have to be careful again of how it's used. That's when some of them I listed, talk with your doctor. Or else you could do just the, and swell your knee up instead of making you able to walk or run like having to be in the arms. Thank you, great question.
Thank you, Don. So we're gonna take a quick break. It's 11 now. If we could get started by 11:10, that would be great. So fill up your coffee, take a bathroom break, and we're gonna go, for those of us in the room, out to the Sugar Shack, which is across the parking lot. And we'll meet Patrick over there, and then it's just a short walk into the woods.